A Misesian Model of General Disequilibrium. By Dante Bayona. He intends only his own security. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Adam Smith. The Wealth of Nations, 1776. Introduction. For a long time, we have had the idea that the actions of individuals, when coordinated through markets, seem to achieve a situation that is somewhat beneficial for society as a whole. In 1874, in his work, Elements of Pure Political Economy, or Theory of Social Wealth, Leon Walras sought to demonstrate how all markets interacted with each other until they reached a resting situation. Thus, the excess demand from one market was transmitted to another market, and jointly both markets balanced each other. To put it simply, it is something like this. Let's imagine that due to an increase in demand, the price of a good A starts to rise. This increases the demand for the substitute good B. This increase in the demand for good B slightly reduces the initial increase in the demand for good A. And so, all the markets in the economy seem to adjust together. This gives us the idea that an external shock seems to be cushioned and smoothed by various intertwined markets. But this does not account for large periodic incoordinations that occur in the system, such as the Depression of 1929 and the Depression of 2008. While this type of analysis of interrelated markets was always considered part of microeconomics, an alternative system with ad hoc equations to explain the working of the whole economy was developed. And thus, it was precisely J.M. Keynes who, disregarding the explanations of the classical economists, began to develop what we all know today as macroeconomics, marginal propensity to consume, multiplier, etc. Today many economists have returned to the general equilibrium analysis of markets as the basis for macroeconomics, but the results do not appear to be satisfactory. This was stated by Robert Lucas in a conference remembering Kenneth Arrow, about his failed attempt with Milton Friedman to include money in a general equilibrium model. In addition to this, there is the notion of classical economists that real variables and nominal variables are separate worlds. There have been attempts to overcome this problem, but the results do not appear to be satisfactory either. Something that has not been developed much is how to integrate the analysis of the business cycle presented by Ludwig von Mises to Walrasian analysis. Would it be possible to integrate them? An implicit assumption of the Walrasian model. The previous explanation of how the increase in demand in one market is transmitted to another market and then returns to the first market, implicitly assumes that the demands of the different markets have a negative slope, and that the supplies of the different markets have a positive slope. Having such types of slopes, both supply and demand represent the rising scarcity of the real economic world. And so the intersection of the supply and demand curves functions as a center of gravity for the system. But what if someone manipulates some information and makes it appear that something that was previously expensive to produce is now no longer so? That is, what would happen if a supply that was previously upward sloping now becomes downward sloping? What if the previously downward sloping demand curve now slopes upward? The market for loanable funds, a supply with negative slope. Under a 100% reserve gold standard, issuing more money means having to produce more gold first. Gold is a scarce resource that is increasingly expensive to produce, and therefore we can assume that its supply has a positive slope. Thus, under a 100% reserve, the money supply curve probably has the same slope as the gold supply curve. But this changes once we introduce fractional reserve, because for each previous level of gold, there is more money supply. The lower the required reserve, the higher the quantity of paper money, for the same quantity of gold. Furthermore, while in the classic upward-sloping supply curve, when the price decreases, the quantity supplied decreases, what we observe in the current banking system is that when the interest rate is low, banks supply more, not less. And the smaller the fractional reserve, the more banks can expand the money supply in the form of credit money. In microeconomics, downward-sloping supply curves are used to represent economies of scale. This means that producing a larger quantity, instead of costing more and more, costs less and less. Thus, in the long term an industry could adjust its costs through technology, reducing them in time more and more. But in the case of the money supply, it is not technology that reduces the cost of producing money, but rather an increasingly smaller legal reserve requirement. Thus, costs do not increase but decrease. Producing more money, under a smaller and smaller fractional reserve, does not cost more, but costs less and less. Therefore, the best representation of that money supply curve is one with a negative slope. This money supply curve is not the same as the gold supply curve. When you have a supply curve with a positive slope, a decrease in price implies a reduction in the quantity supplied, for a company that generally faces increasing costs. But in a non-gold system, producing more money in the form of credit is practically inexpensive. While it is true that banks will analyze the growing risk that loans will not be repaid, banks also know that they will charge interest on money they create out of thin air. Some of them might even expect to be rescued by the government if something goes wrong. They do not have to produce gold, they only have to print a checkbook. And these days, not even that. When the interest rate falls, some entities will have more incentives to be more creative in the types of loans they provide. For example, loans with very low interest rates for the first 5 years, loans with less credit requirements, ninja loans, etc. They will also earn fees for loans origination, and then, for packaging those loans to sell them in the stock market. Those asset-backed securities then will be used as collateral for more loans. They will also earn interest for the speculative margin loans they provide. On top of that, all their competitors are doing the same, and in order to satisfy their clients' demands they need to keep dancing until the music stops. It does not make much sense to use the classic money supply curve of positive slope when what is observed in the real world is the opposite. The ability of banks to issue more and more credit money when the system moves further and further away from the 100% reserve is represented by the Misesian multiplier. Unstable equilibrium in the loanable funds market, two supply curves of negative slope. If we assume that supply is downward sloping, then two cases can occur below the point where the supply curve and the demand curve intersect. Since both, supply and demand, have a negative slope, one or the other must have a greater negative slope, and that will cause two types of market equilibrium, a stable equilibrium and an unstable equilibrium. If below the point of intersection, the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, for a given level of interest rate, that is, if the demand curve is to the right of the supply curve, then the excess demand will make the price rise until it returns to the point of intersection of the two curves. the point of intersection of the two curves will continue to function as the market's center of gravity. This is the case of stable equilibrium. On the other hand, if below the point of intersection of the supply and demand curves, the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, for a given level of interest rate, that is, the supply curve lies to the right of the demand curve, then the excess supply will cause the price to fall further and further away from the point of intersection of the two curves. In this case, the intersection of the supply and demand curves no longer functions as the center of gravity, attractor of the system. This is the case of unstable equilibrium. In both cases, the downward slope of the supply of loanable funds is determined by the multiplier effect of the fractional reserve, the Misesian multiplier. What remains to find out is, which of the two situations we have. Is the supply curve to the right of the demand curve, or is the demand curve to the right of the supply curve? What factors can transform a situation into the other? And let us remember that, in this situation, it is the excess supply what creates the unstable equilibrium. Unstable equilibrium in speculative markets. A downward sloping demand curve represents the situation in which, when the price of the good increases, the quantity demanded decreases, and this is so because there is scarcity in the world. For, if the price of something goes up, then one has to start looking for a substitute, because resources are scarce. But how to represent the case in which, as the price of something increases, its quantity demanded increases? That should be represented by a demand curve that is upward sloping. The upward sloping demand curve has already been used in microeconomics to represent the given good, the case where poor people demand more of a good, even though the price of the good rises. But here the upward sloping demand curve represents a different situation. People demanding more and more of something, because they expect the price to keep rising, and, more importantly, because the bank gives them credit to make those purchases not because they are poor. If banks could not give away credit, if banks could not print banknotes so easily, people would just want to buy, but they would not be able to do it so easily. If the downward sloping demand curve represents the scarcity of the economic world, the upward sloping demand curve represents the situation where someone has apparently made the world's scarcity disappear. Given that supply and demand now have a positive slope, above the point where both curves intersect, two situations can occur. The supply curve is to the right of the demand curve, or the demand curve is to the right of the supply curve. The first case originates a stable equilibrium, since for a given price level the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, and this excess supply causes the price to decrease towards the point where both curves intersect. On the other hand, if the demand curve is to the right of the supply curve, the excess demand causes the price to rise even more, and to move further and further away from the point where both curves intersect. It is the case of an unstable equilibrium. This is a good representation of a speculative situation in the gold market, in the mortgage market, or in the stock market. In the gold market, it could be the case that people demand more gold hoping the price will rise further, while at the same time the suppliers restrict the quantity supplied hoping to be able to sell it at a higher price later. The demand could also increase by short selling. When the bubble bursts, people supply more, although the price continues to fall, and at the same time less is demanded, although the price continues to fall. This oversupply pushes the price further down. While there have been attempts to represent speculative markets with both demand and supply having negative slopes, such representation does not capture the nature of scarcity on the demand side. Impact of an external shock on markets with unstable equilibrium versus the impact on classical markets. In a classical market economy, that is, markets with upward-sloping supply curves and downward-sloping demand curves, any external shock is cushioned by several interlocking markets. Perfectly competitive markets do not have to be assumed. If an external shock increases the demand for good A, the excess demand that is created also increases the demand for substitute goods and alters the demands for the factors of production for both goods. And the increase in demand for the substitute good decreases the initial increase in the demand for good A. In general equilibrium, this is called system stability analysis. This analyzes under what conditions the system, after being affected by an external shock, converges once more towards equilibrium. In a classical market system, the shock is cushioned by several markets and, after adjusting relatively smoothly, returns to a situation of constant rotation. The result is different when the system has some markets with unstable equilibrium. The external shock could occur in the speculative market, and then be transmitted to the loanable funds market, or it could first occur in the loanable funds market and then be transmitted to a speculative market. For example, buying houses could become fashionable, and this external shock would increase the demand. So, a few years before the 2008 crisis, one could hear everywhere that home prices never go down, and that led people to buy houses with the intention of selling them at a higher price in a few years. Before the crisis, people bought houses in poor condition to repair and resell them. Large business groups build many apartment buildings, all in the hope of selling at a higher price. Similar situations have been seen since the tulip bubble a few centuries ago. And at the same time, banks provided more and more credit, given the government's intervention that was aimed at lowering interest rates. Also, some developments in financial engineering allowed banks to package mortgages, convert them into bonds that they later sold to the stock market, and then they used those proceeds to issue more credit money. Plus the well-known margin loans for speculation. The result was an uncontrollable spiral downward in the loanable funds market, and an uncontrollable spiral upward in speculative markets. The result was not a return to equilibrium, but a general disequilibrium in the economy. The economy's bankruptcy occurs when speculators crash against the wall of reality, when they realize the true value of their speculations, and debts become unpayable. The entire production system is distorted by a speculative bubble and by the massive issuance of credit money. The opposite of the soft and cushioned functioning that classical economists had in mind. Keynes, the classics, and the loanable funds market. The only graph that appears in Keynes's general theory is the graph of the loanable funds market. And Keynes put it there to show that it was useless. Perhaps at the time of the classical economists, in walrus time, the money supply curve was a reflection of the gold supply curve, and it was well represented by an upward sloping supply. But in the last 100 years it has clearly changed. If printing money no longer costs for banks, as it used to, when they had to get gold first, if banks now print more credit money even though interest rates fall, then a better representation of the supply curve is downward sloping. The classical equation of Q times P equals M times V must also be rethought. If the fractional reserve is 100%, that equation may be true. But with fractional reserve less than 100%, the equation should be better represented like this: Q times P equals Mises times M times V, where M is the Misesian multiplier, the inverse of the fractional reserve. Thus, QP will not be affected only by an initial increase in M, and by a supposed changing speed V, but by the time such initial increase in the money supply can be multiplied. Perhaps instead of focusing on the supposed variability of the velocity of money, more emphasis should be placed on the almost unlimited capacity of banks to multiply money. Conclusions. In a normal world of scarce resources, all men act as managers of scarcity, either as suppliers or as buyers. In that normal world, supplies have positive slopes and demands have negative slopes. And in that system the words of Adam Smith are fulfilled, that each individual seeking his own interest achieves a social well-being that he did not seek, the efficient administration of the scarce resources of the entire society. The price vector is the invisible hand that guides individuals. But when real-world scarcity is distorted, the coordinating function of prices suffers. The price vector no longer serves as a compass for individuals and for society. That is, each individual seeking his own interest continues to use prices as a compass for his action. But that action no longer benefits society. This paper has analyzed the unstable equilibrium in the loanable funds market, and the unstable equilibrium in speculative markets. But between the two, the one that creates the problem seems to be the loanable funds market, because without massive loans, people would not have enough money to speculate. Kenneth Arrow, considered the greatest exponent of general equilibrium, lamented that general equilibrium did not take into account the imbalances that Keynes raised. But it is not Keynes but Mises who through his analysis of the fractional reserve sheds light on these imbalances, and on how to cure them, a return to the gold standard or something similar. Mises is a natural continuation of classical economics. The Mises multiplier corrects the naive model of the classical economists. What this paper has ultimately put forward is a macroeconomic explanation without Keynes. This disequilibrium model can be represented with differential equations, making the stability and convergence of the system ultimately dependent on the Misesian multiplier. But we must not fall into some of the excesses of mathematization of general equilibrium in mainstream. For example, it has been suggested that if human beings do not have convex preferences, then general equilibrium does not exist. It has been said that if there is no access to credit markets, then general equilibrium does not exist. It has been said that if there are no futures markets, then there is no general equilibrium either. This is known as incomplete markets. And not to even mention the social policy conclusions reached using the second social welfare theorem. For Austrian economists things are simple and clear. The demand curve has a negative slope and the supply curve has a positive slope, because praxeologically man acts. It is not necessary to start counting equations, as the mathematician Walras proposed, to verify the existence of such an equilibrium in the real world. Nor should we fall into the idea that for general equilibrium to exist in the economy, there must first be a mathematical solution to the issue.